The results of our analysis showed that in New England, customers could save up to $630 million per year as a result of adding 9 gigawatts of offshore wind to the system.
So who's our guest today, Jeannie?
Today, we have Shelley Kwok from Synapse Energy Economics, our colleague. Hi, Shelley.
Hi, Shelley.
Hi, Bruce. Hi, Jeannie. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for being here. What are we talking about today?
Today, we're talking about a Synapse report that was just released pretty recently that we did on behalf of the Sierra Club. It does a lot of cool analysis that quantifies the benefits of offshore wind in New England, and those benefits relate to economics, climate change, and public health.
Well, first of all, set the stage for us. I think that everybody knows renewable energy is a great idea. Some people have mixed feelings about offshore wind, but I think you really have to understand a little bit about the setup in New England. Like, what do we already use, and just give us a little bit of background for why this matters.
Yeah, sure. So based off of data from ISO New England for last year, 2023, more than half of our generation was powered by natural gas power plants. So New England's pretty reliant on natural gas for electricity generation, and we also use kind of a lot of gas for residential and commercial heating. So this report wanted to kind of dive into the impacts of shifting away some of our reliance on natural gas to renewable sources like offshore wind.
And so what did you find when you started looking into it?
Yeah, so the results were pretty exciting and favorable in terms of offshore wind benefits. The results of our analysis showed that in New England, customers could save up to $630 million per year as a result of adding 9 gigawatts of offshore wind to the system. We chose to model 9 gigawatts of offshore wind because Massachusetts, Connecticut, and Rhode Island have pretty impressive goals for how much offshore wind they want to install by 2030. So when we added up all of those targets together, it came out to roughly 9 gigawatts. So we focused our analysis on specifically quantifying that amount of offshore wind in New England.
So who's actually saving all that money?
It would be distributed across the customers of New England. So depending on your specific state, you might see slightly different benefits if you're in Massachusetts versus Connecticut.
Can you tell us about your model or your methodology?
What our model does is estimate essentially a price suppression effect that would be kind of observed as a result of all this new offshore wind coming online. So this is a stylized graph that illustrates how new offshore wind would essentially shift out the supply curve and change the point where the supply and demand curves intersect. So here we have the price of wholesale electricity on the y-axis, and then the quantity of electricity demand in megawatts on the x-axis. And so the new offshore wind, which is represented in orange, shifts the supply curve from the lighter blue line, the supply without offshore wind, to the darker blue line, which is the supply with offshore wind. And as you can see, as the supply curve shifts out to the right, it intersects with the demand curve in pink at a lower point. So the difference between the original intersection point up here and the new intersection point down here represents that reduction in the price of electricity in the wholesale market. And this is a benefit that would essentially be observed by the wholesale electricity price in New England and would trickle down as a benefit into customer bills and what we pay for electricity.
Awesome. Seems like a good deal. When you were doing this analysis and had this finding, did it raise any surprises or any more questions for you?
The magnitude of the offshore wind benefits was very positive. There's been some, I think, pushback around the expense and price of offshore wind. And so I would say I was happy to see that the results showed that offshore wind could have this much benefit to electricity prices. So I can even scroll to, let's see, this graph here, which shows the actual results from our model. So the wholesale electricity prices are on the y-axis, and then we modeled 23 different weather years. So we used historical data from 2000 to 2023 from ISO New England. So we could capture how different variations in weather patterns would have impacts on the price of electricity. And when we did our analysis, essentially with and without offshore wind, we noticed that the 9 gigawatts of offshore wind that New England's targeting would have potential to reduce that wholesale electricity price by 45 to 60%, depending on the weather year. So the magnitude of our results definitely surprised me.
So in your intro, you mentioned this will reduce the amount of natural gas we use for electricity generation. Are there other interactions with the gas supply or gas prices or things that you found?
So this graph was also produced by ISO New England, and it sort of illustrates how closely tied the price of natural gas is with the price we pay for wholesale electricity. So there's been a ton of volatility. This graph goes back from 2003 to present day, and shows that there's a very strong correlation between spiking natural gas prices resulting in spiking electricity prices. So the hope is that if we shift our dependence on using gas for electricity in New England to kind of blending that with offshore wind, then we wouldn't be as subject to these price spikes, at least in the power sector. And it could actually have benefits in terms of the price that we pay for gas in the residential and commercial sectors for heating. Like if we free up some of the gas pipelines and we're not requiring as much gas to go to power plants, then it could potentially reduce some of the volatility and the price that we pay for gas to heat our homes. The other graph that we had put in our report that could be interesting to talk about is just how much money New England is spending on natural gas. And there's a concern that we're spending all this money and it goes out of the region. It doesn't really stimulate the local economy or produce jobs for people in New England. So going back to the year 2000, if you sum up all of the money that New England has spent on purchasing gas just for the purposes of generating electricity, the cumulative spending on natural gas for electricity generation in New England was $65 billion. So that's an average of $3 billion per year that just kind of flows right out of the regional economy. And then in some of these years, like 2008, 2005, we paid even $5 billion in that 1 year just for gas generation.
So on average, this is cutting that about in half if we were to add the 9.
Yeah, so our results showed that if we add the 9 gigawatts of offshore wind, we could reduce our spending on gas by 1.5 billion, so roughly half in some of the years.
So it seems like you're telling the nerd show audience that building this large slug of offshore wind capacity for New England will help the economy create jobs, it'll reduce carbon, and it'll save a lot of money on wholesale electricity prices. There must be a catch.
As far as our report could tell, there's no real catch. I mean, the price of offshore wind agreements has been increasing in the past few years, and I think there have been some cancellations of contracts as a result of things like inflation and supply chain. So our analysis does take into account the cost of offshore wind. It's not just only the benefits that we looked into. So we did do an analysis where we netted out all of the avoided energy costs along with avoided REC costs on one side of the equation, and then accounting for the cost of offshore wind PPAs on the other side. We used data from a NYSERDA resource that was just released in, I believe, March of this year. So a pretty recent bid price. And so they are estimating in New York roughly $150 per megawatt hour of offshore wind generation. So it's higher than some of the historical contracts that we've seen in the region. We did account for that. And even with that higher price, the potential impacts, like we saw, of that shifting of the supply curve, that reduction in prices across all of New England would still be a large enough benefit to counteract the impact of spending a little bit more for offshore wind generation.
So if people want to see all the details of supporting the graphs that you've shown and the analysis you were just talking about, where can they find the report, and do they have to pay a lot of money for it?
The report is free on Synapse's website. The Sierra Club has been doing a bunch of awesome coverage of it as well. So
awesome. Well, thank you. I'm so glad that you did this report. I'm so glad we're sharing it with our audience. And is there follow-on work that is still needed for this topic?
Well, we've gotten some interest from people in other regions outside of New England to do similar analyses of the benefits of offshore wind in their particular neck of the woods. So it's possible that we could kind of replicate this methodology and do it for people in different parts of the country. It really comes down to the data availability. ISO New England publishes a lot of really good historical hourly data, and as well as data on offshore wind generation and capacity factors. So as long as that information's available elsewhere, we could probably keep doing these types of reports.
That's great. Cool. Well, thank you so much for being on the show today.
Yeah, thank you so much.